Good. Where's my?
I'm happy to introduce myself, Jim. Don't worry.
Good idea. That'd be great.
That sounds like a good idea.
Oh, just a sec here.
Go.
All right, Gary. So who are you, Gary?
Just let him introduce
All right.
himself.
And, Rick, if you could give me the ability to share my screen, if you're the one controlling the Zoom room.
Got it.
Okay, it looks like I have the power. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you know, I'm a longtime colleague of Rich Sundin. I started at USC 25 years ago, and I remember him hosting a nice welcome party for myself and 3 new faculty colleagues way back in August of 1996. So it's been a pleasure to get to know him over the years, and it's too bad that he's not around as much, but he still pops his head in now and then. So as Jim said, I was trained as an economist. I currently direct the Price Center for Social Innovation and the Price School of Public Policy, and also the region's Homelessness Policy Research Institute. And it's a collaboration of more than 30 researchers and 30 researchers and about 15 institutions in and around the region. We have the goal collectively to accelerate culturally informed solutions to ending homelessness here in LA County by advancing knowledge and creating transformational partnerships between policy, practice, and research. So that's kind of what we're all about. My approach this morning is to have it be very conversational. I have a few slides. I could have done all sorts of slides, but I find that to be not as engaging as just kind of questions and answers. If some of you have questions that I'm not able to answer, I'm happy to get back to you and or point you to resources where those answers might be. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of put up a few slides to kind of get us started. Let me share those. So Jim noted that it's possible that many of us feel like that homelessness is what we would call an intractable problem, a grand challenge, something that has gotten so far out of hand that we can't do anything about it. And in some ways, it's quite reasonable why we feel that way. And we feel that way in part because we have sowed the seeds within our broad, society, especially here in LA, so that there would be millions of people who were on the edge, who were financially, on the edge. About 40% of people say they don't, if they had a major expense, they wouldn't be able to pay it, and that they could possibly lose their place of residence in that time. So it is actually a pretty dramatic thing. What I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about, what are the steps that need to happen, and part of that's understanding how we got here. And part of that's then understanding kind of the set of things that we can do collectively, both from the government side, from nonprofits, from civil society to make a difference. So I think one of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about homelessness is that, the people experiencing homelessness are quite different in ways that we don't fully appreciate. One of the pieces of recent data that I saw just really, I think it was about 3-4 weeks ago, that I hadn't fully appreciated is that now here in California, half of the people experiencing homelessness are over the age of 50.
Wow.
And when you think about what that means in terms of what kinds of services they might need, and in fact, they're more likely to have more physical health issues. It just, again, we have to confront that and act on it. But again, most people don't think about homelessness being an issue for people who are middle-aged or older. And that's in part because of the baby boom generation, and there's just more people.
Can I interrupt here? I would think that at age 50, most people have their mortgages paid off.
If they had a mortgage in the house to live in, Jim.
Well,
So what we
Oh.
know about, LA count, or the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles, is that we are a majority renter, society. And so in that context, we're talking about, it is true that maybe of the people who own homes, they're on their way to having their homes paid off. But more than half the population lives in a renter household. So when you're talking about 11 million people in LA County, that's 5.5 million people who are, kind of in that renter situation. So it's a lot of people. So that's one fact that I just came up with, or just learned, and that this was based on work from Margot Kuchel, who's at the University of California, San Francisco. But these two terms I put up here just to kind of give people a sense of kind of how we think about the homeless population. So there's the chronically homeless, and HUD actually has a specific definition for people who are chronically homeless. And they attach certain services to that population. So they have some sort of disabling condition. So that could be a physical illness, a mental illness, an addiction, something like that. And they've been homeless for more than a year, or 4 different times over the last 3 years. So of the homeless population, you could say that this is a big number. You could think this is a small number, but it's around 1/4 of those experiencing homelessness at any point in time are considered chronically homeless. So these are the people who, it does cost money to take care of them, because not only do they need housing, but they often need services with that housing. On the other hand, most of the people who are homeless are what we would call newly homeless. The first time homeless, often due to some sort of life-changing event. They're homeless less than a year. They're very likely to live in their car. So here in LA County, just to give you a sense, 1/3 of all homeless people live in their cars or an RV or something like that. And again, most people aren't thinking about the homeless in that context. People who might be living in cars, because you don't necessarily see people living in cars. Most people, when they think of homeless, are thinking about this background picture, as you see here, people living in tents and those kinds of things. But in fact, only about 1/3 of people who are homeless are actually living on the streets. 1/3 live in cars, and 1/3 are in some sort of interim housing. So it could be a city or county-owned shelter or something run by a nonprofit organization.
question.
Yes.
How good are the numbers? How do we know how many people really are homeless? And are the homeless counted in the census? In other words, if they're living in a car or a tent or whatever,
Yeah.
the people that count noses would have trouble finding them, wouldn't they?
Yeah, so in terms of, we probably underestimate the number of people living in cars who are homeless, because so just to give a sense of the data that we have, so once a year, there's something called a point in time count here in Los Angeles County. This year being an exception because of the pandemic. We're required by HUD to count the homeless every other year. But LA County until this year has counted the homeless every year. You do this in January. And then in LA County, we do something additional, which enables us to get more data. And we actually do a subsample to ask a whole set of questions, which is part of where this data comes from, to understand why someone became homeless. What are the characteristics that they have? What are the issues that they're facing? Are they working? Are they not working? Those kinds of things. So once a year, we do a pretty good census of the number of people experiencing homelessness. But one of the things you're not going to do, if you see a tent and someone in it, you're not going to, open the tent up and see how many people are living in it. Similarly, with a car, someone might be in a car, but unless it's obvious that there is something different about that car or RV, in the sense, like you can tell someone's living in it, you may not actually identify that someone's living in that car. So it is likely an undercount as it relates to certainly people living in cars. And so people estimate, just to give a sense of the raw numbers, and I didn't bring lots and lots of data, but I certainly can share it with you. There's about 65,000 at the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic, that were experiencing homelessness in LA County. And, you know, at any point during the year, people estimate there's probably around 100,000 people that experience homelessness at one point in time during the year, but we don't have, you know, precise numbers of that because we only count people at kind of one point in time. And unless you actually receive services, we may not know that you were ever homeless. So that gives you a sense of the rough parameters of how many people. And so if you kind of do the math and you can, you know, we have 11 million people in LA County. If around 100,000 experience homelessness at some point in time, then it gives you the sense of what percentage of people. It's still a very rare event, but 100,000 people is a whole lot of people. Yeah, any other questions now, just in terms of understanding who are the homeless?
Are the homeless mostly urban as opposed to rural? How and
Well, this is
Rural-
LA.
oh,
So-
I'm sorry. Okay, all right, fair.
Well, I mean, I don't know the answer to that specifically. I know in California, there's over 150,000 total people experiencing homelessness. The majority of the people experiencing homelessness are in urban areas.
I would think it'd be difficult to count the rural homeless
That's right.
if there's very much. If there's very much, I don't know.
That's right. There certainly is rural homelessness, but we're talking about, you know, the counts that we see. For instance, I work with partners in Riverside County, and we're talking about hundreds of people. Let's say in kind of the Coachella Valley area, you know, and that population is 400,000 in Coachella Valley. So 400 people is actually a somewhat similar ratio to what we have here. It's just that we have 11 million and we have 100,000. So it's, you know, orders of magnitude different. So I'm not sure if the rate of people experiencing homelessness is any different. It's just I mean, I think we could appreciate it. That's why we were talking about traffic earlier, but 11 million people in LA County, that we would be the I think the 9th largest state in the country, you know, so we have a ton of people in LA County.
Yeah.
The other thing that I just wanted to note is that among the newly homeless, and this is something that again speaks to a slide I'll have later in terms of the reasons people become homeless. 59% of people who become homeless say that the reason they became homeless is because of some economic factor. So it could be that they, you know, lost their job. Just very recently, it could be that they were unable to pay their rent. And of course, losing a job might cause you to be unable to pay their rent. And there's a growing number of people who their rents just keep going fast, you know, up faster than they're able to pay. And what we actually observe most of the time is that people don't often just have this life-changing event and then they immediately become homeless. But what they end up doing is they end up going to live with friends or family or whatever they can do to hang on. At some point, though, that becomes a crowded situation, potentially with their family and friends. So they move, you know, from that situation of having their own place to kind of doubling up with another family or friends. Usually then someone in that family might start living in their car to alleviate some of those pressures. And then if things continue to progress poorly, then they might end up completely living in their car. And if again, things progress poorly, they could end up losing their car and ending up on the streets. So it's not a kind of just a moment in time where someone just falls onto the street from having been housed, but really this progression of trying to hang on before they actually get to the street. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that the people that you see in your communities that are homeless, the majority of those people actually lived in that community before they became homeless.
Wow.
We don't see a lot of mobility in and out of, like, for instance, the city of Los Angeles, or I should say, we don't see any more mobility in and out of the city of Los Angeles among the homeless population than we do among the general population. So roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of people who were homeless in LA actually lived in LA before. And those are exactly the same numbers as just the general population of non-homeless from the census data. So those are just a few kind of characteristics of the homeless. And I don't know if there are any other questions on kind of who are the homeless and those kinds of things before we start talking about the reasons why.
Well, just personal, almost personal experience. My dad's family, he had an uncle who lost his business back. This was way back in the Depression, and his whole family wound up moving in with my dad's family for an extended period of time because they were just, and I guess back in those days, it happened to a lot of people. So maybe people were more empathetic because they had the personal experience of it. But yeah, but I mean, if you have that community that, like where my dad grew up, everybody was related to everybody. They had a million cousins and stuff like that. But in LA, when everybody comes from everywhere else, it seems like there might be less opportunity for people to have a relative or somebody that they can rely on.
Yeah, I think that's probably a conversation for another day. To be honest, I resonate with everything you said. I can share my own personal experiences with family members who lost their cars or lost their jobs, and then they would just kind of bounce around with their RV and park it in your front yard, and and you would let them come in at night and do what they needed to do and go back, and they'd sleep in their RV if you didn't have space. And I think that is true more generally in society here in the US and perhaps other countries as well, where there's a little bit of a breakdown of kind of how people view themselves in their community than there was in the past. There's fear of kind of what could happen, what people might be bringing into your house if they have, maybe they've had a drug addiction or that kind of thing. But I think maybe we can just talk about that in some of the next slides in terms of talking about the causes. And we kind of started to talk about the economic ones. And I really think that what's so acute now are these economic factors. And that's really what has driven the big jump in homelessness. So even in a time when the economy has been good, so this is, thinking about from 2010 until 2019, the economy was growing and those kinds of things. What was happening is that rents were going up much faster than people's incomes who were just median income or less. So you could be low income, very low income, or median income. And in LA County, a full 30% of people who are renters are paying more than half their income as rent.
Oh my gosh.
And that's gone up steadily from 2010 to 2019. So basically that percentage was, closer to 23% in 2010, and it's just ticked up steadily. So if you're paying more than half your income as rent, and you could do your own math and see where that leads you. If you're a homeowner, then now maybe you have your home paid off. Well, then that you're in really good shape. But if you're renting and you're paying half your income as rent, it doesn't leave a lot of room for things. We did a survey.
Question.
Yes.
When you say the rent is going up, is that
Device audio? What does that mean?
is that the same as saying that the availability that they're priced out?
Yeah. So if
There's not enough housing, so there's supply and demand.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a whole nother conversation. This is actually where my expertise lives within the kind of overall space and trying to understand the homeless population is in the housing market. That's where I've kind of did all of my research back in the 90s and 2000s, et cetera. And in California, basically roughly, right around the end of the 70s, early 80s, we decided that, everybody that had come into California to experience the California dream, that we were actually happy with the number of people who had come to California. We actually didn't really want more people in California. This was, we had hit it. So we kind of systematically put into place controls, whether they were environmental controls that would slow down housing to make sure we didn't, harm the environment, which had a lot of good, obviously, attached to that. Or they were just planning processes. Back in the 60s, the city of Los Angeles was zoned for 10 million people. Now it's zoned for 4.2 million people. And so we, just very systematically reduced the amount of housing that we would allow ourselves to build. And supply and demand dictates that if people still want to live here, then
Can you repeat that? What you just said? That the zoning?
Yeah, in the 60s, the zoning for LA allowed us to build housing for 10 million people. Now our
Zoning.
population, or now the zoning allows the number of people to be 4.2 million in LA, which is roughly our population.
You mean the city of LA or the county of LA?
City. So, I mean, it just shows like, so there were plans to allow LA and especially those downtown Wilshire corridors, those kinds of places to be extremely dense, just like Manhattan. And we essentially kind of stopped doing that writ large. And so we put ourselves in a situation where we basically capped our growth based on now our current zoning. And so you'll see one of the critical reforms is to allow housing to meet the population, because otherwise we're just going to be, as long as there's still a reason people want to come here to work, there's going to be pressure for rents to go up faster than people's incomes.
Gary, can I take you back to who are the homeless? Can you speak a little bit about the family dynamics here, parents of children and or single parents?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's still the case that the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness are themselves single. But it is, families are growing. I'm trying to see, I have some other data. I don't know if I have the exact percentage of people who are, I guess I don't have the exact percentage of families. I think it's roughly 20% of people have kids with them, but it could be less than that at this point. I know that by gender, 65% of people experiencing homelessness are male, 35% female, and it's usually the parent with kids is a woman, and so it's like half of that sample of 33% roughly that actually have kids with them. What we know is that economic factors are driving family homelessness even more than individual homelessness. So they report it's 71% of families, meaning an adult with children, report that economic factors have driven them to become homeless. And so it's not a, people think of family homelessness that may be a domestic violence.
Yeah.
That matters, but it isn't the primary driver. Question?
If folks could mute when they're not speaking, that would be great.
No problem. So just to talk about some of the other factors, there are structural factors. So a variety of our institutions, we know that people who have contact with those institutions are much more likely to become homeless than someone else. So one institution is the foster care system. So people who are in the foster care system, they age out of the foster care system, and they often have nowhere to go. And I know there's, a vibrant nonprofit community. My pastor's oldest daughter works in this area in LA. I don't work in this area, but I know it's an important an issue for people to really think about. What do you do with young adults who have aged out of the foster care system? We also know that people who have been incarcerated at any point in time have a much higher likelihood of becoming homeless than someone who hasn't. In part, that's because it's very, very difficult for them to get housing. In part, it's because of legislation. So for instance, if you were incarcerated and you might be excluded from receiving federal subsidies for housing, especially depending on what the offense is. And so if you have to go from being incarcerated to finding a job to getting housing, and then on your background check, it shows you were incarcerated, someone who's renting, especially in a situation like, again, pre-pandemic, where vacancy rates were less than 2%, they'll just skip over people who are incarcerated. They don't want them in their place. They know it's going to be hard for them to find jobs. And so that's an important risk factor. And it's something that we have to deal with. And then the third thing is you can't really avoid this topic, is that our systems are systematically racist. And there was a report, which I would point you to, that was produced in 2019. The Los Angeles Housing Service Authority goes by the name LAHSA. You may have heard of them. It's our continuum of care in LA County. They comprised a committee to understand why Black people were experiencing homelessness at much higher rates than other populations. So just to give you a sense of the data, Black people in LA County represent 9.5% of the population, but 33.9% of the homeless population. And these sorts of numbers are replicated, kind of over and over again. So what we would call in the academy disproportionate impact. So for instance, we've done a study in the Center for Social Innovation, and we found that in LA police data, Black people are 3 times as likely to be stopped by the police in every neighborhood in LA than white or Latino populations. That we know then kind of goes on your record, both it has implications both for employment and also could put you at greater risk of eventually being convicted or incarcerated. And what's especially challenging or pernicious is the fact that if you're arrested but you're not even convicted, and if you're convicted but not incarcerated, you get the same flag on your background check. And so if someone is not being kind of distinguishing, if you have an employer who just says, oh, well, there's an arrest on the record, I'm out, even if someone hasn't even been incarcerated or convicted, then that causes problems. So that's one set of examples of why you have a higher arrest rate. You're going to have it make it much more difficult to get a job. You're going to have it much more difficult to find employment, to find housing. And we could look at other examples. I've done research looking at housing market discrimination. And what we find is that there's, I think the proverb, it's a Far East proverb that talks about the death by, I forget if it's 5,000 cuts or 30,000 cuts or those kinds of things. But what we find is that if you are someone that has a name that kind of implies that your heritage is Black, and someone celebrating your African heritage with that name, then you're going to be, 5% less likely to receive a response when you send an email to someone who's renting an apartment than someone with a white sounding name. If you do get a response, you're going to be asked for additional information to prove your employment than someone who's white. Once you meet the person, you're going to be asked again, you're going to have a much more intense background check if you're Black than if you're white. And so what ends up happening is that each one of these stages, you might only be 2% discrimination or 5% discrimination, but it adds up cumulatively. And so this report also, really goes into those details. And so what you can see is that our systems actually lead to the fact that we have 3 times the number of Black people experiencing homelessness than their overall representation in the population. And so it really isn't critical to address those specific issues in order for us to end homelessness in LA County.
Could I interject here? So how do you fix that? Because it seems like it would be, it's pervasive, right? I mean, vast numbers of landlords do this little incremental, discrimination, or maybe in some cases more overt discrimination. But how do you fix it? You would have to be able to prove that a person did a bad thing to find that person, or you see what I'm saying? It's so easy to see statistically this is the problem, but It's so much harder to me to figure out, well, what do you do? What legislative remedy is there? What can one do to fix that?
So in part, we know that there will always be some level of criminality, and I do call this criminality because it violates fair housing legislation. People cheat on their taxes, but we don't always talk about, well, what can we do to stop people from cheating on taxes? It's against the law. People are still going to do it, and so then it comes to how much do we care about this issue to actually enforce this law, fair housing law. And what we've seen over time is that different administrations at the federal level will invest in enforcing this law, or they'll actually not invest. They'll cut staff in enforcing the law. And I think the Trump administration was bolder than most administrations, and they said that they're not going to enforce fair housing in the way, like they just basically, you know, kind of pulled way back. And so in some ways, it does seem, you know, kind of like, well, we can't get to zero. You just like people, you know, I was doing my taxes yesterday, so taxes is on my mind, you know, but you can't get to eliminate all cheating on taxes. But if you actually create systems on the kind of the front end that make it easier to identify cheating, or in this case, discrimination, and you spend more time enforcing fair housing legislation, then landlords are going to, you know, think a little bit harder about whether to discriminate. So those are the things that I would say there are really important. But it doesn't just come from, you can't legislate morality. It does come from a cultural change as well, so that people can really understand why it is that some of their own biases exist. So some people may be discriminating not because they themselves are viewing Black people differently than white people in terms of some inherent value or who they are, but they might be discriminating against Black people because they know that Black people are going to have a harder time in the labor market because people who are in the labor market are discriminating against Black people. And so this is, in some sense, that pervasiveness that you're speaking of is, you know, in the academy, we call that statistical discrimination versus pernicious discrimination, where you yourself are racist, but you act as if, because, you know, Black people are exposed to racism, we know that that actually harms their ability to have as good a job as a white person on average. And therefore you might discriminate if you're a landlord because you just think, well, their incomes are less stable. And that's because racism impacts their income stability. So it's not something that you clearly solve overnight. We've certainly seen the progress with respect to civil rights over, you know, long periods, 100 years or so, but we've also seen that there still is a lot of discrimination within our systems that impact Black people. And I've only spoke of the labor market and the housing market.
Well, and yeah, and so for instance, in Nazi Germany, I mean, an individual might not have anything against Jewish people, but they can see what the society is doing to anybody who helps Jewish people, and so they don't do it.
That's right.
Yeah, so I guess there's the macro thing, but for like the housing thing, it might be hard. If there's a landlord who owns 3 units, it might be hard to ever get enough statistics to say, oh, this is a systematic problem. This person is making bad decisions consistently. We can, you know, come after this person in you know, with some kind of punitive action. But if there are landlords that have a large number of units, then it may be easier to make that case, right?
That's right. And so, I mean, if you invest more in resources, and these do happen still all the time, even though, you know, the Trump administration, you know, took a lot of resources out of this, and you just like random audits, you know, in for the IRS, you just randomly audit people. And so what you do is you basically send a Black person and a white person to that landlord, you know, and you do it virtually first, and then you do it in person, and you see what are the likelihood of making an offer on a place. And so these procedures of how you enforce this are well known. But again, if you're small, you may not get picked. You're much more likely to get picked for an audit, if you will, if you're larger, for sure. So just to kind of move things along, and because I think we're targeting what, a 9:30 end, is that correct? Whoever's in charge of the.
Yeah, about that.
Okay.
Or a little more. Yeah.
I was muted, so 9:45 is the answer.
Okay. So, you know, we talked about in some sense already, these economic factors in some detail. Just wanted to kind of lay over what COVID-19 and the pandemic has exacerbated. And certainly what we've seen is that, especially among the Black population, we've seen unemployment rates skyrocket. And that's because their employment is a much more precarious employment. We've seen among the Latino population in particular, that there were a lot of people working in industries that are what we would call essential. And in those kind of essential industries, they've been exposed to COVID at higher rates than others because they've had to continue working. And so we've actually seen case rates and death rates much higher in the Latino population And it's simply correlated to the fact that they're in the industries where they had to continue working, where some of us, like myself, was able to work from my own home office. The eviction crisis, I put a question mark here because it's possible now with some of the most recent legislation that we may or may not have enough money for rental assistance for people who have lost jobs. I think this is an unknown factor. I've seen estimates of the need to pay back rent that range from 11 billion to 55 billion. I believe this legislation kind of gave us about half of kind of that high end number. I think it was 26 billion. I don't remember exactly this morning, but so it's not exactly clear if there's going to be still a lot of back rent. However, the fact that we don't know how quickly the economy will come back and so forth really means that we should keep a sharp eye on what's happening, for communities that, were already low income or, moderate income, to make sure that there's not, a lot of back rent in those communities. Thinking about some of the solutions, because this is kind of where I wanted to get to, in our conversation, and seeing if we can answer Jim's question of, is this solvable? Well, in the short term, it kind of putting money in people's hands who have lost jobs, we have seen has been effective. So we've seen the CARES Act, when people who lost their job got these unemployment supplements that actually kept people current paying their rent. So the people who were potentially housing insecure, they were then able to cover their rent at higher rates than we anticipated. We also were able to use some of the money from the CARES Act. Some of you may have heard of Project Roomkey. Project Roomkey enabled the government to rent motel rooms, and in most cases these were kind of whole motels, whether it was a Motel 6 or it was one of the older motels that have kind of just in private hands, where people were kind of renting their places typically at a week at a time or a month at a time. And this was, really a remarkable kind of, I guess, proof case that you could house people pretty quickly if you had the housing to house them and the resources to do so. And so this kind of approach actually ended up housing somewhere in the order of 4,000 people within 3 months' time, which was pretty rapid. People who, were previously living on the streets, or they were in a congregate shelter where exposure to COVID would have been, quite dangerous. And one of the, I guess, if there is good news with the pandemic for the homeless population, is that they have not in LA County, because of some of these interventions, had COVID at higher rates than the general population. Of course, too many people have had COVID anyway, but at least these policy remedies enabled people to be protected who were experiencing homelessness. The third short-term solution is we actually can invest in reducing labor and housing market discrimination with the policies that I described. The law already exists, so we just need to put resources in there so that people know that behavior is not acceptable. In the medium term, again, I actually wrote a piece called "The Blueprint for Rental Market Stabilization." You can find it on our website. And I was concerned that we weren't going to put enough money aside in the short term to pay everybody's back rent. And so I noted that what we need to figure out as a way is that, small landlords need to get money in their pockets too. Nationwide, it's the case that around 60% of all landlords own a single unit or a single building. And so they're not corporate and so on and so forth. Many of those people, that's a primary source of income for them. That's what they've chosen to do. And so if people aren't paying them rent in the short run because of eviction moratorium, you can't get someone else new in there. You have to address that. And so it might be the case now that, what I was suggesting, which was to finance people's, back rent with some sort of government program, and then allow renters to pay that back over a long time, 10 years or more at 0% interest or very low interest, might be not necessary. But we do need to think about what's happening for landlords, because what you don't want to have is the non-payment of rent to spill over into them then not being able to pay their mortgages, which then could lead to some financial crisis, which we saw back in 2008 and 2010, and that leads to a whole nother kind of cascade. So we don't want that. But again, this new legislation may have taken care of that issue a bit. The other medium-term solution has been to expand permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. Some of you may have heard of Project Homekey, and this is actually for the purchase of motels that, because of the underutilization of hospitality during the pandemic, some hotel operators and motel operators have said, we're going to get out of this business. And so we have actually been able to buy statewide quite a number of motels and hotels for the purpose of providing housing longer term for people experiencing homelessness. And with some rehab, you've been able to put in, like kitchenettes and those kinds of things there. So that's all in process right now.
You said we can find out more information at your website. What is your website?
So I direct the Price Center for Social Innovation. So if you go to USC Price Center for Social Innovation, you can go there. And one of our special projects is the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. And if you go to the, you can just go in the search bar and there's information on all of these kinds of things there. And I think I'll put up the website, or at least the Twitter feed, which can get you to the website at the end of the slide.
That's great.
The longer terms, this is, I think it was Bill who was kind of asking about how do you deal with racism. I think I really appreciated this report. I contributed to it, but it was led by Manuel Pastor at USC and a team at UCLA's Public Policy School, where they noted that in the report, we had this quote, which says, in many ways, COVID-19 is the disease that revealed our social illnesses of anti-Black racism, precarious employment, sharp racial wealth gaps, and digital access, unaffordable housing, growing homelessness, unresponsive government, and so much more. And so I think what we kind of, as you dig deep in this, if you're trying to end homelessness, and we saw the disproportionality, again, like the overrepresentation of the Black population there, you actually have to not just ignore and look at race, but to understand the systems that have led to that disproportionality. And so that's kind of first and foremost, is to address and center racial equity in what we do. Other long-term reforms are really important, are the zoning reforms that allow us to build housing, especially in the places where it makes a lot of sense, near transit, near job centers, those kinds of places. We need to rethink our kind of systems and taxes, because especially at the city level, what we have, here in California is we have a system where if you can get people to spend in your jurisdiction, then you get more money. And if you have more people living in your jurisdiction, because of property tax, Prop 13 and so on and so forth, if people are long-term residents, then you don't get as much of an increment from building new housing and so forth. So we have this weird tax incentive is to favor commercial retail development versus housing. There's certainly some things like broader forces that are shifting that. So number one, the fact that people are buying online a lot more than in the past means that people who are purchasing, the money actually will go back to those jurisdictions because you're purchasing from your home. But I think we can do a lot better than that. And there are different proposals out there. And California considered one 25 years ago, but it ended up failing. And then the last one is to think more broadly about housing subsidies. They don't have to be housing subsidies of the size that we see with what was called the Section 8 voucher program, now called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, because we simply don't yet have the resources to do that. But if we kind of thought about what it means to pay more than half your income as rent, and thought about how you subsidize people who are paying more than half their income as rent, because right now, people who are eligible for the federal housing subsidies, only 1 in 4, and then in LA County, its estimates are 1 in 6 to 1 in 8 of people actually get them, simply because there aren't enough resources. And so I have argued, and others have argued, that we need to spread that out. And maybe we don't give as large a housing subsidies to people, which would, keep them from paying more than 30% of their income as rent, but instead help more people, even if they're still having to pay a larger percentage of their income as rent. And then just finally, I thought I'd throw this out there for conversation in terms of what can we do individually, what can we do as, you know, in a church context, those of us who are involved in nonprofit work, etc. We had an interesting symposium that was a partnership between the Price Center for Social Innovation and the Schwarzenegger Institute at USC. And the nice thing about working with Governor Schwarzenegger is that he has a really powerful Rolodex. He can call up politicians all around the country and the state. And so when he calls, they come. This was done in February of 2020. So this is like the last giant event that I was a part of. And that is, you can find it on our website if you want to kind of watch the whole thing. But Secretary Carson came out, and one of the things that he kind of pointed out, just as a numbers game, is that if each church or synagogue or mosque adopted a person experiencing homelessness, you could actually end homelessness. And I think that fact kind of signals that it is solvable, right, as a problem. However, it is also a little bit disconnected. If a church is doing it, there's a lot of learning for churches to say, okay, well, what does that mean for us to kind of adopt a homeless person? If we did that, you know, you may or may not be connected to the other systems of resources. So you may not be connected to job training programs. You may not be connected to mental health kind of provision, those kinds of things. And so it is possible in terms of just thinking about the numbers, but it may not be the most efficient or most connected way to work within communities. One possible thing that churches can look at are to participate in safe parking programs. A lot of our churches, especially if they're old, I don't know how old your church is, you may have parking lots that during the week are very underutilized, and then they get full, you know, on Sundays. You know, this is not as true as in some parts of the country where they have very vast parking lots that are underutilized. What we've noticed is, you know, I mentioned that 1/3 of all homeless in LA County live in their cars. Almost none of them are parking at safe parking lots. And in part, this is because of challenges to get nonprofit organizations to sign up to allow their facilities to be used. Now, I'll admit that it's, you know, this is again a little bit of a lift. You have to talk to the insurance for your facility to see, can we do this? What does this mean? And those kinds of things. But there are resources at the county level to fund having security and to, you know, to partner with providers of hygiene services and so forth for people. And so offering your, you know, facility from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. or something like that is something that, you know, some churches have done, but not that many, if we're really looking at the numbers. Another option is to partner with existing organizations that are already doing good work and just simply need additional support, either financially or volunteer time and those kinds of things. And I suspect that, you know, in a group this size, many of you individually are doing that already. The church that you're in may be already doing this. And these are the kinds of things that I think, you know, do make a lot of sense, because it is important to be networked within the overall systems that are providing support for people. And so I think this is a good path forward as well. And then, you know, one of the things that people don't think about as directly is we actually don't want people to become homeless. What we want to do is to catch people who are already housing insecure. So for instance, I had noted that a lot of these older motel facilities, the ones that aren't in chains anymore, but were built back in the 50s, you know, are the kinds of facilities where, you know, people are renting a week at a time who lose their housing, they rent a month at a time, those kinds of things. And so, you know, one of the things our church does here in where I live is that we work with 3 of these motels to just kind of be a support for the people who are living there. And, you know, in some cases, you might learn of somebody that's about to even lose that. And so if you have people who can then connect them to resources that might be available, you can prevent people from, becoming homeless or living in their cars that are already pretty precariously housed. And so with that, I'll just kind of put this up. This is where you can find me on the internet. If you have your preferred, kind of website, you guys, if you like Facebook, if you like Twitter, who knows, but it's all out there. But with that, I'd happy to stop and answer any other questions you have for today.
Well, I have one quick question.
Yeah.
Are you giving are your slides available to us?
Oh, absolutely. I sent them to Rich Sundin earlier, and he said he has them, but I'm happy to send them along. And
Rich is here now, right, Rich?
maybe not.
Maybe, no, he is here, but he's probably muted.
Oh, there he is. I see him now. Hey, Rich.
Hey, Jerry, how you doing? I'm the one that warned everybody about daylight saving time, and I changed my alarm clock, but then I didn't change my wristwatches. So I was eating breakfast, reading the paper, sitting there saying, "Well, God, it's 10 after 8. I better get on the line and hear." So I apologize. Welcome. Yeah, I can probably help people get your website and slides also.
Because ultimately, that's the takeaway question. What can we do? Or what should our society do? And is it primarily the federal government and not the state government? Does the state government have much say in this?
You turn off the light.
Well, as it relates to the, you can actually advocate for more housing in your community. That matters. That's state government, that's local government. And you can say, I want more housing in Manhattan Beach. Now, I know I just said that, and most of you are going to turn me off right now. If you're a normal group, you're like, no, I love Manhattan Beach just like it is. I don't want more people in Manhattan Beach. This is what I like. But as you will note here, if every community says exactly that, then we're going to continue to have rents go up faster than people's incomes. And if you own your home, you're like, that's okay. I already own my home. I'm good. But if you have 60% of the population that are renting, you're causing more and more pressure on them. And so it is the case that even Manhattan Beach could increase the number of housing in some places, and that would be part of the answer. So that is a state and local issue, is to get more housing.
Just to interject, I live in adjacent Redondo Beach, and there's a current kerfuffle going on about the state mandate to rezone for increased housing capacity.
Absolutely.
And it's like, where are we possibly going to zone for an additional 1,400 housing units? Because that's sort of what is required to meet the state requirement at this point.
Right.
And everyone's, well, we can't possibly do that. Where would we put them?
Well, North Redondo already has 2 on a lot, so I would think they would be better. They would be closer to playing by the rules than Manhattan is, aren't they?
Well, there's some statistics that have come out that suggest that, and these may already be reflected in what's achievable, like on the order of 1,000 units, just building out existing zoning. But I believe the 1,400 is in addition to that. So, again, zoning or has to change somewhere to enable increased density or simply more housing to be built where, there was commercial property zoned or that.
Well, and Redondo has consistently voted against dense housing, more dense housing, even along the Edison plant.
Well, like I
old
said,
Edison,
from the
yes,
1980s on,
and
everybody's been voting against it.
Millie Anderson did a good job.
Okay, go ahead, Gary, I think.
Oh, all I was saying is that from the 1980s, we've been consistently.
Millie Anderson from our church got low-income housing for seniors.
Yeah.
Gary, Sheila, we're having a hard time hearing you, and so Gary,
I do think in Manhattan Beach, You, oh, yeah, I think in Manhattan Beach, senior housing has men income housing.
Sheila, you should probably turn off your video because you've got low bandwidth, it says. And so if it's trying to do video and audio, it isn't going to work. So if you could just turn off your video and just do audio, that'll probably work better.
So,
But we can also move to other things. I know that's very controversial to talk about. I don't want to leave people with that uncomfortable
so,
fact, but it does matter for you to, you know, to be supportive of that piece as well, because you can vote.
so supporting that last point. Many of the things that were on the what we can do chart
Mhm.
looked like it was not for the inexperienced, not for the uninformed, not for amateurs. So is there a focus in county government that can provide expert advice and can be a traffic cop, a director to services and so on?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say the last three things that I put up there, the first one with Ben Carson, my only criticism of that is that it required a lot of expertise for a church to figure out what that would be. But if you look at all the other ones, those are not for people who have expertise. So Safe Parking LA, you can just go to Safe Parking LA and connect with them, and they're going to tell you exactly what you need to do if you have a parking lot and you want to allow it to be used from the time of 8 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning, and they'll kind of connect you to the resources and to what needs to happen and all of that, and kind of walk you through that. That's one example. Then if you're instead partnering with organizations, so in my community, I live on the edge of Long Beach, near Orange County, and there's the Illumination Foundation, and they do this sort of work. And so, as a church, you can say, okay, what do you need us to do? And so sometimes we've gone and did a big church work day if they acquired new units, and we kind of help them clean them all up and get them ready to go. Sometimes they need resources, sometimes they need something else. So to partner directly with an organization that's already doing the work is something you can immediately do, but it's that long-term commitment, not just to say, well, we're going to do this once a year, or we're going to do this, when you call, but to say, we're there with you, and to call them and support them. Our church got involved in kind of what we now call the motel ministry, because the city mayor of Cypress, California, which is in Orange County, just desperately called the church and said, we need help. These people are struggling, and we need the churches to step up. So there are opportunities, but I think it's that long-term commitment with one of these things. A church doesn't have to do all the above, but with all of those, it doesn't require a lot of individual knowledge or control, but instead working with existing organizations.
So if you were going to go looking for an existing organization, where would you start?
Well, I don't know what's next to Manhattan Beach or Redondo Beach and so forth. But I said, if you're interested in safe parking, go to Safe Parking LA. If you're interested in some of the others, I can guess that someone on this call knows of at least 2 or 3 or 4 organizations that are working in and around the beach communities there, and you can just join them.
Family Promise is one of them, Dan, that we already participate in. So we can look for more. Family Promise is one that we already participate in, and we can do more probably.
Right.
The Economist magazine talks a lot about subsidies, in particular the mortgage tax subsidies. Do you have a position on that? Or that's tax policy versus
Right.
Helping people directly. But what?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you could think about it as an issue of fairness, I don't know if everyone knows the history of the mortgage interest deduction, but it was back in the 80s, we actually allowed all debt to be written off on taxes. So mortgage debt, everything else. During the tax reform under the Reagan administration, his goal was to get rid of all of the deductions for debt in order to have lower interest or lower tax rates in total. He didn't actually get all the way there. People said, no, let's keep this one. Let's keep this one. So it's not like the mortgage interest deduction was like deliberate policy. It was one that, you know, homeowners like fought for to keep. If you're thinking about fairness, then you would say, well, why can't we have something of the same size for renters? And if you did the same size for renters, and this is what I was talking about broader housing subsidies, to me, that just seems fair. Like if you're going to subsidize people who have mortgages, why not subsidize people who are paying rents? Or vice versa, if you don't want to subsidize the mortgage anymore, and it takes a while to transition to something like that, then you can have, I would say, more equitable housing policy. So that's a pretty simple thing to do. You know, when Cory Booker, Kamala Harris were running for president, they advanced some renter tax credit proposals. California has a very paltry renters tax credit for people making under 75,000. You get a few $100 back at the end of the year. That's not, you know, a sizable enough renters tax credit to be comparable to those of us who, you know, pay mortgages, and we get, you know, get quite a few $1,000s back on our taxes. That's absolutely something that should be looked at.
You say the impact has to do with fairness. What about the impact to distorting the market?
Well, it does distort the market. You know, the fact that you have the renters, the mortgage interest deduction causes house prices to be even higher than they would be otherwise. And so to that end, it provides, you know, something quite nice for people who are already homeowners, but for people who may want to become a homeowner, it makes it much more expensive for them to get into homeownership. And so it does cause things to, it does distort the market.
Well, and it gives even more money to the people who can afford to buy houses in even more expensive neighborhoods, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Gary, could you speak a little bit, since you're an economist, to the notion of simply increasing the supply of housing and whether or not that leads to more affordable housing at the, you know, for example, at the low end of the rental market for people who, you know, are having affordability issues?
Yeah, there's been at least 5 studies that have come out in the last 2 years to address that question. And people even looked at building luxury apartments in a neighborhood and how did that trickle down, if you will. But most of the studies were focused on just building market rate housing. So housing that's not subsidized by contract or covenant, but just, you know, going, you know, just new housing in the neighborhood. And every one of those studies, even building luxury apartments, did find that it reduced the rents going forward, or the rate of rent increase for other housing, which was not, you know, new. And so to that end, we're talking about 2% per year, 5% per year. It actually does matter. It increases affordable housing, you know, generally, but it's not something that, you know, is you build one new building, it's not going to kind of be so massive that then now people who are earning $50,000 a year can then afford, you know, they drop from paying 50% of their income as rent to 45% of their income as rent, right? It takes a while to get there, but it's absolutely the case that, you know, the research tells us if you build more, it does provide more affordability. At the same time, you know, when I talk about like you do a renter's tax credit, and or if you're thinking about broader based housing subsidies, if you're doing that and not building, you're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah,
right?
You described this imbalance earlier, that incomes were rising more slowly than rents. Obviously, so, and that you are asserting that increasing the supply of housing will reduce or that rental increase, you know, factor.
Yeah.
What enables people who haven't been able to, you know, there's as you say, spending 40 or 50% of their income on housing to get back in? You know, what's the near term, midterm solution to that while we're waiting for more housing to be built?
Well, that's what I was thinking. You know, I think the rental tax credit approach and or broader housing subsidies just to lower the burden is really important.
Talk about quality of life, density, open spaces and parks, like taking out the cement banks on the LA River and making those parks and that sort of thing. And that, what does that do?
Well, and if all you do is you kind of create kind of more parks and so on and so forth and make them more attractive to live, If you don't do anything else, then people will want to live there, and that'll drive up prices in the neighborhoods. And we've seen that in the data as well. And so you really need to think about, again, kind of doing all of these things at the same time.
Yeah.
Add housing while you're doing those redevelopments. as well.
Maybe people would go for density if they had more parks. You know, like Central Park in New York is just a wonderful
Yeah,
place,
absolutely.
but it allows high density.
Going back to our area here in Manhattan Beach and probably in Hermosa, I don't think there's almost any vacant lots.
Mhm.
Now, so how can Manhattan Beach or Hermosa take in a greater population? They could zone from R1 to R2 or R2 to R3, I suppose. But it's going to be a huge resistance to do that. I mean, when is a town full? If a town is full, where do you put more people?
Well, I'm not going to fully have the answer to that, but I also think that, you zone to R4 in Manhattan Beach, you may see absolutely nothing change. But you also allow the possibility, which doesn't exist now. So it's just, I say do that, and then, it may not change, but why restrict it? The other thing coming online, going forward is that part of the issue has to do with parking and being crowded. And, if there is 20 years from now, automation of vehicles, if there are ways that people are able to get around from a mobility standpoint that doesn't require, to have 2-3 cars in every family, then that changes the calculus as well. And so there's some places you're like, well, there's no way I could put 4 units here on this lot and 8 cars. And you're like, yeah, that's right. You couldn't. So that's a long-term issue.
But if you change the housing rules in Manhattan Beach, where you could add a grandparent's house in the backyard, a small house, where your extended family could move in there, it would open up other housing and work.
State law already requires that to be allowed. But it turns out that just because you're allowed to do something doesn't mean that Manhattan Beach might make it easy for you to do it.
Yeah, that's a problem.
So right now you can do it. But different communities are being more or less accommodating of the state law.
It's about time to close it. Do you have any last words you want to give us before we close?
Well, I'll go back to, I forget who asked it. Maybe it was Dan Hutchinson. If I got your name right there, what can we do? Actually, there's a lot of things that we can do collectively to partner with, organizations that are already doing good work, but you have to, not just, kind of sit back and go, it's a hopeless situation, it's just too much, but to kind of work on there are political things that we talked about, like whether it's allowing more housing or addressing issues of systematic racism. We can do that politically by supporting candidates that are actually going to, shift resources to make an environment more equitable in those ways. There are partner organizations that you can commit to and say, we're going to be there with you within our community. And you can, really have an important impact to, get beyond Ben Carson's goal of one person being helped by each church. You can certainly do a lot more than that if you work with others.
Okay, we really appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
I did, when I was going to introduce you, I was going to tell people about how difficult it was for you to get you here, because Gary and his son play in the band at the church every other Sunday, I guess it is.
Yeah.
And then today, he and his wife are leaving for a little birthday party for her for a few days. So anyway, appreciate your time and your thoughts and the stimulating ideas that you had for us.
All right, it's great to be here, and just let me know if you need anything else. And take care.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Very much.
Thanks a lot. Great talk. Really appreciate it.
Anything else, Jim, you want to say?
No, I think well, I want to get a copy of the presentation, the PowerPoints. So Rich, I guess I get that from you.
I think so.
Just post it.
I'll have to check my email though. I don't recall getting it, but
If you give it to Rick, he can post it
yeah.
and get it up faster, probably.
Since we're on this topic of homelessness, I think I can share publicly now that Family Promise of South Bay is being contracted by a number of cities to help them provide services to their homeless populations. So it's represents a fairly significant increase in the number of homeless families and people that will be served by Family Promise. Of course, they're not going to be, they'll be using other means than just the rotational housing model that we're most familiar with to try and keep people housed, avoid homelessness, overcome or address the issues that they're facing in their towns. But it's kind of interesting. We're getting, being asked to take on those services on behalf of various cities in our region.
Great news.
All right, I guess that's it. I think we're at 9:47.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you,
Unless
Jim.
there's any more quick questions, we're gonna go shut down. All right,
I'm going.
good.
Bye-bye, all.
Going, going, gone.
27.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.